2 sets of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Leading the way through the chalky white pillars was a girl dressed in gray light armor and dark brown hair bouncing on her shoulders. A narrow longsword hung at her waist. Just behind her was a juvenile dragon covered in downy pale yellow hair, its long tail waving. The dragon was just tall enough to see over the girl, though its horns hadn't grown in yet. The girl's name was Rani Arabelle. The juvenile dragon was Tsukikage. Based on this heartwarming and beautiful fairy tale image, it would be hard to imagine that in just a few years this girl and her dragon would form a partnership as an integrity knight and her mount, the strongest battle unit in the entire underworld. But in fact, at this early moment, there wasn't even 100 people in the entire world with greater ability in swordplay and sacred arts than Rani. She had battled at the front line all throughout the dreadful War of the Underworld and the subsequent rebellion of the 4 empires, and had been ultimately promoted to Apprentice Integrity Knight. The first in history to be given that honor based entirely on merit. Despite all that, however, the girl's skill with the blade, sure to flourish further with the training ahead of her, would likely never actually be tested in combat. After 300 years of chaos and warfare, true and absolute peace had arrived in the underworld at last. Imperials, Darklanders, goblins, orcs, ogres, and giants. The 6 races formed a permanent peace pact. The hierarchy of the 4 imperial clans and the upper nobles who had been responsible for torturing the common people were scrapped once and for all. Merchant caravans headed to and from the empty space where the Eastern Gate had once stood, and the visitors from the Dark Territory came to the capital city of Centauria. The field and ignorance that had separated the 2 worlds began to melt away, as surely the lasting melting bit of snow in the sun. The girl ran with her dragon, the light of Solus leaping back and forth across her figure as the line of pillars split into burning stripes. At her hip, a sword that would never again taste the blood of an enemy swing. Like this, 2 sets of footsteps continued into the distance and faded out of earshot. Seemingly out of nowhere, a large butterfly appeared in her wake, fluttering through the hallway as if enjoying the return of silence. "This way, Rani." She turned and rose on tiptoe, looking in the direction of the voice, and soon saw fiery red hair bouncing up and down from across the crowd. Rani made her way through the mass of arts casters and staff members from Central Cathedral, apologizing all the while. Some of them turned to her in annoyance, but they all leaped back out of the way in alarm when they noticed Tsukikage running behind her. Only when she finally slipped through the very front did Rani exhale in relief. "You're so late, it's about to start," her red-haired friend fumed, cheeks puffing with indignation. "I'm sorry," Rani apologized one last time. "I just couldn't pick out what to wear." "You couldn't pick out? You're wearing the same thing you always do," Tisei Strinin exclaimed in disbelief. Like Rani, Tisei was an apprentice integrity knight. Her glinting maple red eyes were close in tint to her hair, and she wore a navy blue skirt and cute printed top that hugged her slender torso. A red leather scabbard hung from her waist, but even that was more like an accessory to complete her outfit. Rani realized with regret that she should have worn the southern-made shawl she had bought last week. On the other side of her friend, Tisei's own dragon, Shimosaki, was rubbing snouts with Tsukikage. Nearby, a young man was watching in display with a gentle smile. His appearance was closer to a boy than a man, but on his sword belt was quite an impressive longsword, as well as 2 throwing blades that were bent in the middle. The priority level exuding from the sword was considerable, but it was nothing compared to the throwing weapons. They looked as thin as paper, but they were divine weapons, a class of item that could only be found in the tiniest numbers throughout the entire world. Rani raised her right fist level to her chest and placed her left hand on the hilt of her sword, the formal knight's salute. "Good morning, Sir Renly." The Integrity Knight Renly Synthesis 27 smiled awkwardly at them over the heads of the dragons. "Good morning, Ronnie. You don't have to be so stuffy today. It's a festival after all." "You call this a festival?" she wondered. It was February 17th of the year 382 of the human era, a perfectly ordinary day on the calendar. There wasn't a single sentence about any celebration on this day in either the basic human law issued last year or the taboo index, which was presently under modification. But a look under the spatial front plaza of Central Cathedral revealed a crowd that was so large it might have contained the entire faculty of the tower. Everybody was in a celebratory mood, holding drinks and snacking on food. Also, the front gate of the cathedral, which was typically closed tight, was open to the people of the capital today. Impromptu standing spaces designated along the inside of the gate were packed with a crowd of at least 1,000 onlookers. Yes, I suppose you can't call it anything but a festival, Tisei admitted. But we probably expected this whenever the swordsman delegate does something. Ronnie nodded in agreement. Of course, I just hope today's events don't knock down the building. The three of them glanced towards the plaza. At the center of attention, which was very difficult to describe, the object was tied down with thin yellow ropes in the middle of the white stone plaza, floating in the block of square-shaped sky 100 miles to a side and howling eerily as the wind passed by it. The simplest description would be to call it a metallic dragon sculpture. But as a sign that it wasn't just some art installation, the upper half of its pointed head was made of clear glass. Short wings were attached to either side of its rather long, flat body, and rather than 2 legs, 2 thick cylinders extended from its enlarged rump. There was no tail. The object was about 5 mils in size, standing up so that the cylinders pointed down, and had orange flames licking out of the rump. It was impossible to say exactly what it was supposed to be. All I can say for certain is that I get a very bad feeling about it, Ronnie thought. She tore her eyes from the metal dragon and looked at the 3 people nearby. One of them, a young swordswoman with long chestnut brown hair that rustled in the breeze and a rapier to the left of her pearl-white skirt, turned to Ronnie, sensing her eyes. She grinned and raised her right hand to beckon the girl over. "Go on, she's calling," said Tisei with a grin, prodding Ronnie's back. The girl hesitated briefly before summoning her courage and stepping over to the yellow rope in front of her. Tsukikage followed her, as always. Trying to make herself as small as possible, aware that the crowd was watching, Ronnie trotted across the open space and came to a stop in front of the swordswoman, giving another crisp and diligent salute. "Good morning, swordswoman subdelegate." "Good morning, Ronnie. Because today is similar to a festival day, you can go ahead and relax a little bit," said the breathtakingly beautiful young woman with a smile. Ronnie let the tension in her shoulders ease a little. "Yes, Lady Asuna." "You don't have to do the whole lady thing, I keep telling you," the other woman pouted. Unfortunately, it was a very difficult request to oblige. The woman before her, who looked only a few years older than Ronnie, was Asuna, swordswoman subdelegate to the Human Unification Council, and in some ways she was an even more exalted person than the delegate himself. Every person in the human realm believed that she was the goddess of creation Stacia Reborn, one of the 3 goddesses from the world's creation legend. She herself steadfastly denied being a god in human flesh, but Ronnie had witnessed in person, at close range, the sight of Asuna creating a tremendous ravine in the earth with a single swing of her sword during the War of the Underworld. After seeing something like that, calling her anything less than lady was unthinkable. If they added a rule to the Nightbook's rule that no formal address should be recognized, that would settle the matter. But until then, she was going to continue no matter what, and she shook her trembling head to indicate as much. Asuna grimaced awkwardly and changed the subject. "Anyway, Ronnie, I understand that when it comes to sacred arts, you're best with heat elements. Is that right?" Yes, she answered, surprised. Asuna leaned in closer to whisper. In that case, I have a request. Can you commune with the heat elements in here and give me a warning if they're about to go haywire? What? Heat elements? In there? Ronnie repeated in confusion, not certain exactly what Asuna was referring to. She looked up at the metallic dragon high above, then noticed two men nearby in an argument. Listen to me, Kiri, my boy. The heat element's canister's life might be capable of theoretically withstanding the heat that is generated, but only if there is an ample supply of frost elements. I know you're not skilled at frost arts, so let me be clear that if the generation of elements stops for even a moment, the whole canister could blow at once, shouted a whiskered 50-something man. His words did not mean anything to Ronnie, but they sounded dangerous. Ronnie knew this man well. He was Sador, a metal worker who was said to be the best at his profession in all of Centauria. He had worked in the city for many years, until he began to assist the knighthood during the rebellion of the Four Empires, when he was named Arsenal Master of Central Cathedral. Across from Master Sador, looked sullen from the brow beating, was a young man of very average looks, with black hair and eyes. He was wearing odd grey clothes, like a long-sleeved top with trousers connected to it. There was no weapons at his sides. Brown gloved hands were clenched behind his head as he argued back at Sador with annoyance. Yeah, I've heard that so many times. I feel like I've got pester bugs in my ears. Also, sir, can you stop with that kitty my boy thing already? I'll never stop. Ever since you brought me that hideous tough branch 3 years ago and made me ruin 6 valuable black brick grindstones to hone that blade, I swore myself that I'd call you boy for the rest of eternity. Sheesh. If I didn't have that sword, the world would have been in a terrible state right now, you know, muttering to himself. The young man abruptly spun around and spotted Ronnie, as soon as she saw the big smile break out on that face, which looked as much like a rambunctious child's as it had the day she had first met him. Ronnie felt something clenching her chest deep down. She bowed, so that if it showed on her face, at least he wouldn't see. Good morning, Kirito. She would have called him sir, too, but in his case, there really was an official rule against calling him that, so Ronnie had no choice but to refer to him as her senior, the way she had when they were both students at the academy. Kirito had once been an elite disciple at the North Centauria Imperial Swordscraft Academy, and now he was the swordsman delegate to the Human Unification Council. He raised a hand to wave and smiled. Hey, Ronnie. How you doing, Tsukikage? Behind Ronnie, the juvenile dragon thrilled loudly and flapped its tiny wings, then leaped onto Kirito and began to lick his cheeks with abandon. She couldn't help but smile at that. Then Ronnie said to the arsenal matter, Good morning, Master. Morning, Miss Ronnie, the old man said, his expression instantly morphing into a sound, beaming smile. She scuttled over to him and asked gently, what was that heat canister thing you were talking about? Just what it sounds like. Look at the rump of Dragoncraft Prototype Unit 1 up there. Dragoncraft? She repeated. It was clear from context that he was referring to the metallic dragon standing before them. It felt strange for her to refer to this lifeless creature as a dragon. Upon closer examination, the odd whistling sound seemed to be coming from the elliptical rear of the object. There are 2 containers crafted from Western adamantium in there, and each one has 10 whole heat elements trapped inside of it. What? Ronnie yelped, shocked. Of the 8 different elements that made up sacred arts, heat was the most tempestuous. Unlike frost or wind elements, which could be contained safely for quite a while, heat elements would quickly exude their heat and light and burn up in mere moments. The very first lesson that any child studying sacred arts learned was that if you summoned a heat element, you had to focus on it until you applied or unleashed its power. But I know adamantium is supposed to be highly heat resistant, but wouldn't exposing it to 10 whole heat elements at once eventually cause it to melt and explode? That's where the trick comes in. On the exterior of the container, we run pipes made of Joran giant centipede shell, which is highly frost-resistant. Those pipes are hooked to frost canisters that supply a steady stream of coal that is designed to prevent the heat canisters from melting down. See? Uh-huh. It was hard for Ronnie to appreciate the trick, because to her heat and frost elements were the building blocks of godly sacred arts, a far cry from the crafting of metal and carapace that blacksmiths and craft people performed. She had never once considered the concept of combining those two very things. "And is that going to work?" she murmured in shock. Sidor's burly arms spread to his sides in a shrug. "I don't know." "What?" "I'm not the one riding in it. The boy is." "What? What does he mean, riding in it?" She lifted her face towards the looming dragon craft, almost afraid of what she would see. Then she noticed, in the part of the pointy head beneath the clear glass pane, what was inarguably a seat. Metal pipes sprawled and writhed around the seat, and little circular panels were placed here and there with tick marks on them. Thin needles were attached to the center of the panels, twitching and turning with each strange roar the craft produced. Do you mean someone's going to sit in there and release the heat elements to cause flames to shoot out of the rump canisters? To fly. Yes, like a dragon, said Kirito, who had rejoined them. Nearby, Tsukikage snorted with distaste at the smell of the craft's metal wings. You can't do this, she shouted, tugging on the sleeve of Kirito's strange outfit. If 20 heat elements all go out of control at the same time, it'll rupture the whole thing. You should use wind elements, like the levitating discs at the cathedral. Actually, the whole shaft is airtight, which is how there's enough pressure from the wind elements alone to make it work. If you want to fly out in the open air, you need the sheer propulsive power of a heat element's explosion, Kirito said, grinning and looking around. Plus, look at how many people are here to watch. If we try to call it off now, we'll have a second rebellion on our hands. You're the one who invited them all to watch? The crowd was here at Central Cathedral Front Plaza because Kirito had made a major proclamation that the cathedral's arsenal would be performing a test demonstration for the public. Now that peace had come to the underworld, the biggest uproar to be found was whatever the human realm's swordsman delegate was getting up to next. The faculty members and citizens had quite enjoyed the test revival of the Northern Cave's guardian dragon, so it was only natural for them to be eager about the next experiment. If Kirito's conversation with the revived dragon had gone any worse than it had, the damage would have been far worse than just a few of the cathedral's trees freezing. Ronnie knew how close they had come, and the thought made her lose her balance. Thankfully, the subdelegate was right behind her to provide stability. Asuna had known Kirito for a long time, apparently, and she said with all-seeing resignation, "There's no point in arguing, Ronnie. When he gets his way, you just have to let him go through with it." "But you can't!" "Well, I suppose you're right," Ronnie mourned, pausing in the act of shaking her head to nod it instead. In these few years, Ronnie had learned full well that when Kirito had his mind set on something, he was going to do it, one way or another. Well, we might as well do everything we can to avoid a terrible disaster, she thought, focusing on the heart of the dragoncraft. While she was an apprentice integrity knight, Ronnie had not yet reached the point of free control over the secret art of the knighthood known as incarnation. Shortening sacred arts to a minimal length through incarnation, the way Kirito and the senior knights did, was impossible for her. But lately, she was getting the knack of sensing the status of generating elements at last. Like Master Sidor had said, there were many heat elements trapped inside the dragoncraft, but that didn't mean that they were behaving themselves. They shivered and trembled with indignation, pulsating as they awaited their chance to break through the shell around them. If they were this unruly in their elemental state, what would happen if they were unleashed? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but at this point, all she could do was watch and wait. I've communed with the heat elements, Lady Asuna. It appears that they're still under control for now, she reported in a murmur. Thanks, Asuna whispered back. Maintain that circuit, then. I will, Ronnie stated, right as she heard Kirito shout from a distance. Let's get started, then. Asuna, give me a countdown. Why does it have to be me? You always did one before we busted into the boss chambers, remember? Kirito said, which didn't make any sense to Ronnie. But Asuna understood and shook her head in disbelief. She raised her hand and uttered the initiation of a sacred art. System call. Next, she smoothly built the command for a voice-enlarging art out of the wind and crystal elements. Asuna's control over incarnation was still developing, but as far as practical application of sacred arts went, even the most elite members of the cathedral couldn't hold a candle to her. Asuna faced the thin, funnel-shaped swirl of glass floating in the air, and said loudly and clearly, Thank you for your patience and interest, everyone. The Cathedral Catholic Arsenal is about to conduct a flight test of Dragoncraft Prototype 1. Her magnified voice filled the area, eliciting a roar from the cathedral faculty beyond the ropes, and the civilians crowded into the spectator area inside the gate. To the north, the armor of the Integrity Knights gleamed and sparkled in the sun from the large terrace on the 30th floor of the building itself. Amid the applause and cheers, Kirito waved to the onlookers and began to climb the long ladder leading up to the Dragoncraft. He reached the head in just seconds, opened part of the clear glass panel, and slid inside. Kirito sat in the seat that pointed up toward the sky and strapped himself down with strips of leather. There were rather large eyewear hanging around his neck, and he brought it up to wrap around his head. Then he leaned over to look at Sidor down below and pointed his thumb upwards. Sidor retreated to where Ronnie and Asuna were standing, then ushered them back another 20+ miles. Ronnie had to gauge the distance carefully, so as to not lose her connection to the heat elements. I will now begin the countdown. Feel free to join in, everyone, Asuna announced to the crowd, as comfortably as if she were used to doing this. She raised her hand and extended all her fingers. Here goes. 10, 9, 8. With each number, she folded in a finger, and the throng of thousands added their voice to the chorus. Tisei and Renly were happily joining in too. Ronnie squeezed Sukukake around the neck and chanted, 7, 6, 5. Suddenly, the vibrating of the heat elements increased. Kirito had begun controlling them directly through incarnation. His astonishing power flowed into Reese too, through the elements of which she was communing. Once again, there was a clenching sensation deep within her chest. This feeling is the one I cannot let leave me. As his page, I have to let it sleep quietly, until the day my life eventually dwindles due to old age. Ronnie could feel her eyes welling up, as she blinked hard, keeping the emotion away from Asuna's attention nearby, as she shouted, 4, 3, 2. The roaring of the Dragoncraft grew louder and louder. The shining silver object began to shudder, and the light coming from the tubes at its base changed from red to orange to yellow. 1, 0! The crowd cheered, shaking the cobblestones. Kirito's voice could be heard distantly shouting, Discharge! That was the worst to release the power of the elements. At once, 20 heat elements burst, releasing the power they contained. There was a tremendous blast, and white flames shot from the rear of the Dragoncraft. It burned the white marble stone that supposedly held near infinite light to the point of turning red, sending up plumes of bright smoke. The crowd buzzed with alarm, and through all that smoke, the metal dragon shot upwards like a silver arrow. The sky was full of high-pitched tearing sounds, like the likes of which Ronnie had never heard before. Jets of fire were rolling from the two tubes as the Dragoncraft soared higher and higher into the air. The ferocity of the unleashed heat elements was so great that when Ronnie held her palms out, the sensation stung her skin. Ordinarily, any container holding that kind of phenomenal heat would lose its life value instantly, melting or burning away. The Dragoncraft should have exploded. But because the narrow piping embedded around the canisters was pumping ultra-cold frost elements through at all times, the heat was contained. As a result, the incredible power of the heat elements was funneled directly towards the open end of the tubes, pushing the huge dragoncraft straight upwards. For the first time in the history of the underworld, a person was flying through the sky on something other than a dragon. "It's incredible!" Tears appeared in Ronnie's eyes for a different reason than they had moments earlier. Through her blotted vision, the silver dragoncraft shot up, and seemingly crescently, beyond even the top of Central Cathedral. If the dragoncraft stayed in one element on the ground, the requirements to generate endless frost elements would quickly sap all of the spatial sacred resources nearby. But moving at high speeds meant the craft could consistently be traveling just as fast enough to stay within an adequate supply of fresh new resources. That meant that hypothetically, the man-made dragon could reach heights that even an ordinary dragon could not approach. At last, Ronnie felt as though she understood the true intention of the swordsman delegate. Kirito wasn't just trying to get that thing to fly. He might be trying to use it to cross the obstacle that no living thing could surpass, the wall at the end of the world. But no sooner had the thought occurred to Ronnie that she sensed the heat elements expanding. The canisters were beginning to warp. The heat was melting them. For whatever reason, the supply of frost elements meant to keep the metal's temperature low had stalled. Lady Asuna, the heat elements," she cried. But then there was an ugly sound from above. Boom! And black smoke began to issue from one of the thruster tubes. The dragoncraft abruptly entered a rotational spin as it rose. The course of the object drifted southwards, right towards the wall of Central Cathedral, around the 95th floor. "It's going to hit!" screamed Ronnie, clenching her fist to her chest, the crowd shrieking with alarm. Asuna drew her rapier from the sheath at her side. She pointed the breathtaking blade, shining with Solas's rainbow light, straight at the cathedral above. "Okie dokie," she cried, which did not sound like the sort of thing a god would say, as she waved the tip of her sword to the left. As though she dragged it herself, the 95th floor and those above it in the enormous central cathedral shifted loudly and heavily to the west. In the span of a single moment, the dragoncraft shot through the space this created, black smoke trailing behind it. There was a bright flash in the sky far to the south. Then came the explosion. Although some of the power had no doubt been expanded in the upwards flight of the dragoncraft, the simultaneous eruption of 20 heat elements was nonetheless a tremendous thing to behold. Because elements could ordinarily be controlled with only one finger at a time, even the greatest of casters could only manage to generate and maintain around 10 elements at once. According to stories, the head of the Senate that had once controlled the Axiom Church could also use his toes, for a total of 20 elements. The late Pontifex administrator could have even used the ends of her hair at terminal points, giving her command of nearly 100 elements at once. But of course, Ronnie had never seen those things for herself. If that was true for a knight like Ronnie, then the civilians who had packed themselves into the cathedral were understandably shocked. An orange light, like a second Solus, flashed high above, and an earth-trembling roar hit their ears as nearly the entire crowd lifted up their arms to cover their heads. Of course, it was only unprocessed heat elements bursting high up in the air, so despite the eye-popping light and sound, there was no actual damage to the people hundreds of miles below on the ground. The onlookers looked back up and saw thick black smoke puffing outwards, hiding the top of cathedral, which had slid back into its rightful place. The explosion had been several times the size of the fireworks that had been shot off to celebrate the new year 2 months earlier. Everyone must have wondered what had happened to the swordsman delegate who was riding that steel dragon. Ronnie was one of them, of course, as she watched wide-eyed with her hands clutched before her breast. "K!" She was about to shout his name when Asuna tapped on her shoulder. "He's all right," the other girl said, without a hint of worry, just as a small shape plummeted right through the bottom of the thick black smoke cloud. It was a person. All the material making up the dragoncraft had evaporated into spatial sacred resources, but there wasn't a single visible burn mark on the dark clothing of the figure who had spun and tumbled downward. The silhouette spread its arms. The fabric of the sleeves seemed to melt behind it, forming thin wings that extended directly from the shoulders. Those dragon-like wings beat a few times, showing the figure's descent until it eventually came to a standing still in the air. It appeared to be the sacred art of flying, thought to be lost forever with the death of the Pontifex. But in fact, this was not an art. He had overwritten the ways of the world entirely, using incarnation to transform the material of his clothes into actual wings and turn himself into a living being capable of flight. There was no other human being in existence who had achieved this feat. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd, as it quickly turned into a tremendous storm of applause. The Dragoncraft flight test, which had been the purpose of this event, had largely been a failure. But Kirito smiled and waved as he slowly descended towards the ground. Rani found herself clapping wildly at the sight of him too. Kirito's ability to put preposterous ideas into motion and achieve preposterous results had not changed in the years she had known him. Despite the fact she was smiling, Rani could sense liquid pooling at the edge of her eyes. She clenched her eyelids shut and wiped the tears away, making a silent prayer for no one's ears but her own. If possible, I hope that these days can last for eternity.